everyone, this is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 10 of This Week in FCPA, a podcast with Tom Fox and Jay Rosen. It's for the week ending June 24, 2016. In this Week in FCPA, Jay and I visit about a podcast Roy Snell and I had on our Unfair and Unbalanced, where Roy discussed victimization. We take a deep dive, or a pretty healthy dive, into the Analogic BK Medical FCPA enforcement actions, which came out earlier in this week. We talk about my series of blog posts this week on training, including why legally, what are your requirements to train, how you should design your training program, how can you effectively evaluate and measure the ROI, and where training may be going into the future. And then Jay talks about an article that was posted by Dirk Lobenbroek, the head of business security and compliance officer at Americas at BSH Home Appliances, entitled Battle of the Documents, Policies versus Procedures versus Guidelines versus Code of Conduct, where Dirk really advocates the need to get the translations part of technical compliance documents correct. The episode comes in at just over 30 minutes. I hope you enjoy it, and thank you very much for listening to This Week in FCPA. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA, a podcast with Jay Rosen and Tom Fox for the week ending June 24, 2016. Jay, we have now had 5 consecutive days of no rain in Houston, Texas, and we are celebrating our 95 to 98 degree weather with 98% humidity, with all of the revelations that you should for a summer solstice. But you have even bigger news, because you are in a child-free house, as I understand it. And
yes.
Perhaps you and Mrs. Translations may be up to something, I understand.
Perhaps, but right now we're enjoying the solitude of the what was Superman's place called? Was it the
Quiet?
Yeah, no, but what was it? The cave of Fortress of Solitude.
Fortress of Solitude, yes.
Yes. So that's what we have here now in Encino, the Fortress of Solitude. And, since we always love to talk about the weather, we've been in triple digits for the last couple weeks, and it makes for great camping weather for Millie and Michaela. So we told them the 3 rules of camp were: always put on sunscreen, always hydrate, and anytime there's somebody there with a camera, get in a picture so mommy and daddy can see what you're up to. So, those are their instructions as we sent them off to camp this week.
Gee, and when I went to camp, the only rule was you had to send your parents a letter once a week, and you had to drop the letter off going into the dinner line. So I guess things have changed.
Just a little
bit. For the middle of June, we had some interesting things happen this week, Jay. We had a very interesting enforcement action announced a little bit earlier this week with a company called Analogic and their, I think, Danish subsidiary, BK Medical. It was interesting for a lot of reasons. I'm going to kind of let you talk about what you may have ascertained from the new pilot program DOJ initiative. But what kind of struck me was their Danish subsidiary had a very sophisticated, long-standing bribery scheme in place, where they basically double billed. The client would double bill. The bills were approved by the CFO, and the payments were routed to offshore bank accounts in known money laundering jurisdictions. You had twice in 2004 and 2008, the parent company raised issues about the entire bribery scheme. I would have thought this was you had a clear intent. You had clear, at least subsidiary senior management involvement, yet you had no criminal conviction or individual prosecutions, I should say, and a relatively low fine and penalty. I was a little surprised that the department took the tack they did. But I know you had some thoughts on it in the light of the new pilot program. So what did you kind of see?
Well, I think I really focused in more on the nuts and bolts of where the ultimate fine ended up being. And normally there's a range of credit that you can get for, cooperating with the government. And the high end of that is a 50% discount. And even though the activity was very egregious, as we discussed, they still ended up getting a 30% discount. So, I think you really already spoke about the salient points, that it was very woeful, that they really went through all lengths to set up this basically kickback and overbilling scheme. So if we're going to read the DOJ and the SEC tea leaves, I still think that, even if you do not have initially the best intentions when you do go into the government, if you do cooperate, there is going to be, a certain credit given. So I think that's what we need to start doing, is watching the calculus. We've had 3 NPAs so far this year, and this is the 4th. So, one of the things that I noticed is there was some commentary that followed up quite quickly after that by Ann Kleebanner Sultan and Mark Allen Bond, both at Miller Chevalier in DC. And they really went into the nuts and bolts of this, and, basically where the client actually went wrong. So, this is stuff that you talk about regularly, high-level accounting failures, unknown third parties that they dealt with, the novel distributor overpayment scheme, and basically, as you alluded to before, that this conduct was flagged twice in 2004 and 2008. So, it's almost like this year we are seeing different examples on how you can cooperate, what levels of cooperation, and what those potential outcomes are. So the conspiracy theorist to myself is wondering, what's the next example that we're going to have shown to us in the next 2 weeks?
Maybe there's another way to look at this, because I've been thinking about this at some length, because I was really stunned by the level, what I consider the low level of fine and penalty based upon the conduct. And in thinking about it, it occurred to me that, the DOJ has really been hiding this information in plain sight, and they've actually been doing it for years. And last fall at the ACI National FCPA conference, the then head of the FCPA unit, Patrick Stokes, gave a talk where he actually charted out and showed the calculations that the DOJ went through to come up with the penalties in cases like Parker Drilling and Hewlett Packard going forward. And part of it was to demonstrate that the DOJ gave significant credit for both cooperation and remediation, and when you with 2 companies who did not self-disclose, and the response from, I guess you call it the marketplace, but us, it was, and certainly a very vocal response, or a very vocal group, was they wanted to have more information on this and more certainty around what they were going to get in terms of credit. That, of course, led to the pilot program, where they detailed you could receive up to a 50% discount if you self-disclosed, remediated, and fully cooperated and disgorged your profits. And then you could get up to a 30% discount, or 25% discount, I guess, if you only cooperated and remediated and disgorged your profits, meaning if you didn't self-disclose. Then we had the the most recent enforcement action, and now we have Analogic. And I think at least I'm going to need to shift my thinking, Jay, from what's the potential liability to what's the potential credit, because we seem to be focusing less on the really bad acts in terms of the penalty they're going to get, to what credit did they engage in. So it's another way to put it might be, once you step over the line of a violation, it really doesn't matter how bad that violation was. What matters is that you self-disclose, you cooperate, you remediate, and you disgorge profits, and you're going to receive a significant discount off the fine and penalty. So at least I may have to rethink this whole penalty. And I thought about it today in the context of Walmart. When Walmart came out, at least based upon the New York Times article, the conduct appeared quite egregious. But Walmart certainly has cooperated. Well, they certainly have remediated, and they've been very vocal and public, I should say, about their remediation, coming on the speaking circuit, writing papers, having interviews with the SEC magazine, et cetera. So we have a fair amount of information on their remediation program. I would have to assume that if they're remediating at that level, they're also cooperating with the government. And even if the facts were as bad as the New York Times alleged, as opposed to the Wall Street Journal version of the facts, Walmart could get a relatively low penalty. So maybe we really need to change our thinking about, well, gosh, how bad could it be, to how much credit can you get? And maybe that's the shift.
Yeah, I think that's definitely one way that people are going to start thinking. The other thing, which we really haven't seen, we've seen a couple false starts in the past, and I know you're going to touch upon it at FedEx, so this might be an opportunity to drop it in, but we still seem to have an issue that if the DOJ cannot really make a good case, is there a reason why we have this other solution, the DPAs, the NPAs, and there still has not been a significant body of case law that's been built up on FCPA violations. So I think that's another piece of the puzzle, and it'd be interesting to see if we see any of that happening in the second half of the year.
Right. Well, the FedEx case was, it's fascinating in and of its own right. My question was, why on earth did the Department of Justice even bring these charges? And for the life of me, I couldn't understand why they brought them, given what happened at the trial court level. Mike Volkov had a great blog post on it this week, and he really explained what had happened. And the DOJ testimony was going to be based upon two DEA agents who had actually worked with FedEx on a number of other criminal investigation matters. And so FedEx had listed them as witnesses and was going to call them, and I think it was going to be either very embarrassing or very bad for the government, particularly if you have embedded DEA agents in a shipping company to help in one level of investigations, and something happens and they turn on the company after having cooperated, or the company having cooperated with the government going forward. So a huge foobar, whatever the reason. And from in the trial lawyer world, when you drop your case before evidence goes on, that's called a big loss. And you really shouldn't have even brought the case. So, but the FCPA professor wrote about it in the context of the Arthur Andersen effect in FCPA cases. And the Arthur Andersen effect is that, for those who can't or don't remember, Arthur Andersen was Enron's accountant. They were part of the overall Enron accounting fraud. And they went to trial, though, on destruction of records after Enron fell, and they lost at trial. That verdict was eventually overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court. Nevertheless, Arthur Andersen ceased to exist because they lost their ability to do public accounting. In many corporations, the lessons they drew from that was some very bad things can happen to you if you go to trial. So the professor focused, and it also had a very strong effect on FCPA, Department of Justice prosecutors. I personally talked to several who said that they, they're not in the business of putting companies out of business. And that's not something that the DOJ wants to do. They want to punish people appropriately, but they don't really want to put U.S. companies out of business, obviously. That doesn't really help many people. So there was an effect both on the prosecution side and on the corporate side. And what I think he misses is that on the corporate side, corporations don't exist to go to trial against the government. Corporations exist, obviously, to make a profit. And if there is 1% chance you're going to lose and 99% chance you're going to win, 99 times out of 100, the corporation will settle. because they don't want to take that 1% chance. And they also may not want some embarrassing reputational damage information to get out, which damage your reputation. And if you go to trial in an FCPA case, you can bet your bottom dollar that every violation you've had is going to come out of trial. So I don't think it's going to put the Arthur Andersen effect to bed. It may ameliorate it a little. And certainly if a company firmly believes under its specific facts that it has done nothing wrong, then it's obviously appropriate for it to exercise its Fifth Amendment right to go to trial. But this one, this case really either should never been brought, probably should never have been brought. And if you're bringing one of those against somebody who's got the money and fortitude to stand up, I think that that's what you'll see going forward. I don't see that happening in the FCPA world because the facts would be so damaging to your reputation that it probably wouldn't be worth it just to sustain a not guilty plea, even if or unless the people who do go to trial are the corporations are so small that the individual owners are the corporation and the corporation are the individual. But I can't imagine a large corporation their takeaway from this is, oh, well, we'll just go to trial against the government in the FCPA case they bring. It's too much incentive to settle. If we tie all of that into the pilot program, it really feels like there's a shift. Something has shifted in the department, and they're going to process these cases more quickly. They're going to give significant credit for the three things that we've harped on: self-disclosure, cooperation during investigation, remediation are four things, and profit disgorgement. And so I think we may, the whole issue of the Arthur Andersen effect or the loss of the Arthur Andersen effect will be really obscured by what's gone on with the pilot program and the new credit the DOJ is given. And we can even point to what happened this week with Analogic as an example.
So would it be fair to say that from a perspective of dealing with these things quickly, from giving better signals to the corporate world out there, do you have any issues with the mechanism of DPAs and NPAs for resolving these matters? And does that consequently mean we're never going to see a body of case law develop? Or do you think somebody is going to have a test case and take it out there, and there will be something else out there, beside the minimal cases that the government has brought and has not brought to successful conclusion?
From the corporate perspective, I think DPAs and NPAs are excellent settlement mechanisms. What corporations want, in my experience, is one thing, and that's certainty. If it's a lot of money, that as long as they know what it is, they can reserve for it. They may not like it, but they can deal with that. They can deal with bad news if they have certainty around it. And a DPA or an NPA, with the exception of perhaps Biomet, who had to re-up on their DPA, you have
twice.
It's going to end. So I think that it actually favors corporations. It certainly favors. It's a one more arrow in the quiver of prosecutors in their settlement tools. But from the corporate perspective, I don't think we'll see DPAs or NPAs abate. And really, if you think about the alternative, say somebody magically waved a wand and said, okay, every case goes to trial. Well, that's in nobody's interest. And it's in nobody's interest because you'll be lined up for years waiting to go to trial. When I started practicing law in Harris County, it was a 7-year wait to go to trial. And if every FCPA case goes to trial simply to get some case law on it, that is, you're not only throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but you've created a solution that it's in search of a problem. So I don't really see doing away with NPAs or DPAs as a good solution to any of that. And from the corporate perspective, those are equally valuable settlement tools. But it does keep us from having a body of case law develop around the FCPA. And that point is absolutely valid. But even if you think about the most recent NPAs and DPAs we've seen, we're starting to get more information. The problem with these documents is it's not the SEC or DOJ just specifying the facts. It's a negotiated document. So a company can, have some room to negotiate what they disclose. Now, they may have other reasons for not disclosing certain information or certain individuals, such as shareholder derivative actions, lawsuits that they may pursue against other employees or senior executives of the corporation. So there's a wide variety of reasons corporations may have would negotiate, but those are negotiated documents, and not all of the facts are in them. So we would not get the full airing that we get in trial, and certainly the dearth of FCPA case laws is something that is really unique to this area of the law. But Jay, I've pontificated on this quite a bit, and we probably could, but there's something that struck me this week that I wanted to ask you about in the guise of your well-known moniker as Mr. Translations. There was an article posted on LinkedIn by, I'm going to have to go to the glasses here, Dirk Lobenbroek, who is the head of Business Security and Compliance Officer Americas at BSH Home Appliances. And he had a really interesting piece on which he called the battle of documents, policies versus procedures versus guidelines versus codes of conduct. And he talked about something that I don't think we really focus on as much in your specialty around translations, which is terminology, getting the right terminology. Even in the FCPA world, sometimes we don't all speak the same language, but certainly a translation from a medical term to a legal term to a commercial term can give room for lack of full understanding. But I think it's even doubled or tripled when you translate from a foreign language. So I know you had the chance to read the article. Kind of what were your thoughts?
Yeah, well, first thing that you said, from when anybody says, let me reemphasize, translate the code of conduct into local language. If you don't prepare a translation, what does that say about you? In the eyes of law enforcement, you don't care about others, and I'll add employees, following your code. So many times you kind of zero in on that if you're not translating, you're not doing your job. So that's a small piece of this. But the other thing he talks about is this terminology angle. So he says, using proper terminology is crucial in the legal and the medical field. Calling an act an assault versus a battery makes a big difference. And if your pain is in the upper or lower chest, it makes a difference. So words have meanings and words have implications. And my takeaway from that is, if we're not speaking the same language in English from an ethics and compliance and remediation perspective, if we're not on a level playing field there, it doesn't even do us any good to go to the translation piece if we haven't figured it out internally. So I thought it's a very direct, very simple idea, but he did such a great job of laying it out, and I'm definitely going to put a link into it in my weekend read. But I thought it was a new voice that we haven't heard it, and right down here in Southern California, he's based in Irvine, so that was something that jumped off. I'd like to throw it back to you. Earlier this week, you and Roy unleashed another version of your Unfair and Unbalanced podcast. And one of the things that we picked up on was the whole victimization angle. So I was wondering if you can touch upon that a little bit.
Yeah. If you don't know Roy Snell, you should. And he's the CEO of the SCCE. But Roy is one of the more interesting and unique thinkers in our space, and he really does think a lot. And the podcast we have together, Unfair and Unbalanced, because of his position, he really doesn't publicly talk a lot about a lot of these topics. So I've been very pleased that he's opened up in a way that has given people some real insights into not only his thinking, but some of the top thinking of the compliance profession. And that's really what the SCCE focuses on, and what Roy focuses on, the compliance profession as a whole. And this podcast, actually, he had written a piece about a speech he saw the Richard Strong give in Minneapolis. And Roy was very impressed by Mr. Strong. He posted it on the SCCE blog site. And so I started off by asking him about his article and what he observed in the speech. And that really led Roy down a different way that I was not expecting. And it was about victimization. And he began by, or he tied it to the Bestrong speech, because Bestrong was given, in Roy's opinion, several opportunities during the talk to become the victim and blame others, blame his company for not giving him training, blame his company for not giving him support, blame his company for not putting internal controls in place, blame others, blame people who requested the bribes. And Bestrong said, nope, 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 nope. It's on me, on me, on me. All my fault, all my fault, all my fault. I did it, I did it, I did it. And that really impacted Roy. But that led him to a, I don't want to say a full rant, maybe that's right, but certainly a lengthy soliloquy. If we can go Hamlet-esque here, a lengthy soliloquy about victimization, and that there really are no victims in compliance, that people make decisions, corporations have roles in compliance in terms of putting policies and procedures and internal controls and detect prongs in place. But we are human beings, and human beings have the right to make decisions. And if you make a decision that crosses that line, you're not a victim, you're a perpetrator. And he was very strong about that. And we'll link the podcast in the show notes. But it was a really interesting way to look at it. And it was really because of the speech that Richard Bestrong gave, and then the Q&A afterwards in Minneapolis, that kind of led Roy to write the article and led us to explore this in the podcast. And I would really urge anybody who's interested in that topic around compliance to look at that podcast. It's on my site. We'll have it in these show notes. It's also on the SCCE. It's called Unfair and Unbalanced. I believe it's episode 8.
And Tom, what is, when Richard referred to it, did he call it the Mickey Rooney effect?
What that reference was, I wrote a piece, blog post a few years ago where I talked about, it was when Mickey Rooney died, or his anniversary or something. Anyway, I was honoring Mickey Rooney. When I was younger, I lived with my grandparents, and my grandmother introduced me to Shakespeare, interestingly enough, by watching a Shakespeare movie that.
And he was Puck, right?
Mickey Rooney was Puck in the movie, and somehow or another that always stuck with me, and so I've always been a big Mickey Rooney fan. Of course, Andy Hardy and his movies going forward. Anyway, using the Mickey Rooney intro, I talked about one of my apocryphal stories that I've heard over the years, which of course is not really apocryphal, but it's along the lines of the following. A regional manager in you name the country once said, if I violate the code of conduct, I may or may not get caught. If I violate the code of conduct and am caught, I may or may not be disciplined. If I miss my numbers for 2 quarters, I'll be fired. And of course, that regional manager never missed his numbers. So it's kind of the mixed message that a corporation sends. And we talked about that in terms of Roy's position was, he made a choice. He's made his choice. Even if the corporation was wrong in communicating that tone, he made a choice. So that was the Mickey Rooney reference.
Got it. So
Midsummer Night's Dream was the play. It was a movie from the 1930s.
Cool. One other thing I just wanted to toss out with some more corporate speak is it was revealed on Monday that a former division of Erickson is under investigation for some impropriety for billing for going for a military contract in Greece.
Yes.
It looks like it's going to be a case of successor liability, but this is what always warms my heart at the end of the press release. Erickson says they're not going to talk about it because it's an ongoing investigation, but then they add, Erickson works actively with its anti-corruption program and has a strong business code of business ethics, which is acknowledged by all employees at the time of employment. Erickson has zero tolerance for corruption and bribery, and we work actively to prevent any kind of corruption within the group. So it's always great to learn about how vigilant they are, and especially they can let us know this when there's an investigation going on and into one of their former divisions.
It certainly is, and as we would say, we appreciate your continued support. So, we've got just a few more minutes left, but if I could throw out a pitch or a ping for blog series that I wrote this week. There was an article last month in Slate magazine where the author really panned ethics and compliance training. And I thought a lot about that, and I ended up writing, started getting going, and it ended up being a 4 blog post series where I explained the legal basis for putting on ethics and compliance training. I talked about how you risk rank and design an effective ethics and compliance training program. I talked about how you evaluate it, and huge shout out to Leona Lewis, because she had a fellow named Joel Smith on her podcast who talked about how do you determine ROI from ethics and compliance training, and which I'd never heard of before. And so I was able to do some research and investigation. Joel's, I would go to her podcast, Masters of Disaster, to check that out. I suppose I could put that in the show notes as well. But anyway, so I've got you a formula for determining ROI of your ethics and compliance training. And then I ended up with where training is going in the future. And it seems to be that the gamification of training is going to occur because of the just stunning success in the gaming world. When I started looking into it, I had no clue that the gaming world is in many ways rivals Hollywood for gross sales. And I missed that. I'm not that generation. I missed gaming. Pong was gaming to me. So Space Invaders was about as sophisticated as I ever got. So I do see the ads on television, and the graphics and the quality and the sound is just stunning. And that's starting to move to corporate training, specifically in legal and ethics training, or ethics and compliance training, I should say. So I ended up with that. So I ended up having a lot of fun with it. It's something that we really don't talk about enough. So shout out to the LV Anderson was her name, the reporter from Slate, for bringing it up and pushing me and others to think and talk about it. So Jay, fortunately, we're at the bottom of the hour. I know you and Mrs. Translations have a nice weekend planned ahead. Actually, I'm going to the same location next week because Brian Wilson is playing the album Pet Sounds at the Hard Rock Cafe in Las Vegas. It's one of my favorite albums of all time. So my wife and I are going up to see Brian Wilson do Pet Sounds, and hopefully some of our Beach Boys songs to celebrate the 4th of July.
Is he going solo, or are there any ex-Beach Boys with him?
That I don't know the answer to. So I know they had a kind of a split, so it'd be interesting to see who's in this band. But if you could see Brian Wilson, the last time I saw Brian Wilson, he was not in too good a shape. It was 1976. So it'd be interesting.
Wow.
Again.
Well, here's sending you some good vibrations.
Good vibrations. Yeah, absolutely. And on the Sloop be John. So hopefully we can have a session next week. Otherwise, have a great weekend.
All right. Thanks, Tom.